So medieval Christianity lasts for 1,000 years, from the 5th century through the 15th century. But we are not going to talk a lot about this period. I will just focus on three major new reinterpretations of the Apocalypse during the medieval period of the Christian Church. The first one is centered around the so-called imperial model. Now, what is imperial model? Imperial model of the Apocalypse is about the so-called legend of the last emperor. The legend of the last emperor comes from the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire. And it finds its way into the West, becomes popular in the West. According to this legend, the Apocalypse is connected not with some angelic figure, but with the figure of power, with the emperor. So at some time in the future, there will come a good emperor who will initiate imperial reforms, and those imperial reforms will lead to the beginning of the millennium, described in Revelation, chapter 20. So it is not Jesus, but the emperor in this version of apocalyptic interpretation who initiates the millennium. People will go through the life of plenty, but in the end of this millennium, the last emperor will step out of power, the Antichrist will replace him, and then we have the scenario of traditional apocalypse. The Antichrist will try to seduce people, there will be the Armageddon, and as a result, the powers of goodness and the powers of evil will fight each other, and the devil, along with his minions, will end up in hell. So again, what is new here is the introduction of the figure of the emperor. Basically, it is a political version of the apocalypse. It is an attempt to politicize the apocalypse or to use the apocalypse for political purposes. The imperial model, as I said, comes from the East, from Byzantium, and finds its way in the West. The cultural center of the medieval Christendom is the fight between the political powers and the religious powers, the fight between the emperors and the popes. The emperors wanted their power to be absolute, and they wanted their power to be applied to the church as well, to the church organization as well. The popes, on the other hand, wanted to be separate from the imperial power, and if possible, they wanted their power to be applied to the power of the state. So the second new interpretation of the apocalypse is known as the Gregorian model. The Pope Gregory VII wanted to reform the church in such a way as to accumulate as much power as possible, not only within the church, but also within the state. This was a theocratic project. Theocracy, as you may remember, is such an organization of political power in which the secular power is executed by the religious authorities. Now, in the end, neither the emperors nor the popes were able to claim absolute power. And in fact, the result of this struggle that lasted for centuries was the separation between the political authorities and the religious authorities. So the idea of the separation between church and state actually goes back to the Middle Ages. But Gregory VII wanted the church to accumulate as much power, and he also saw the church as being threatened from within, from the internal sources, and as well as from the external forces. So that was the period when church was fighting against the heresies That was the period when the Inquisition was established. That was the period when Crusades were in their full swing. So the church was fighting against the external and internal enemies because Gregory VII and his followers thought that the Antichrist is near. And the more we are approaching toward the Armageddon and the end of the apocalypse, the more the Antichrist will resist. So Gregory VII wanted to reform the church in order to strengthen its power because he thought that the apocalypse is approaching and that's how the church should react to it. So that is the second new interpretation of the apocalypse. We may say that this was an attempt to use the book of Revelation for the church purposes, for religious purposes. And finally, the third new interpretation of the apocalypse in the Middle Ages was advanced by the guy whose name was Joachim of Fiore. And Joachim of Fiore was the most popular apocalyptic thinker of his time. So, who was Joachim of Fiore? He was a monk and also an apocalyptic thinker of European fame. He was so famous that Richard the Lionheart, you may remember this name, Richard the Lionheart, on his way to the crusade, one of the crusades, stopped and had an interview with Joachim about the apocalypse and the prospects of the crusades. And Joachim of Fiore told Richard Lionheart that the Antichrist was already born and is very active in the historical arena of the day, and he predicted that the apocalypse is coming very soon. So therefore he encouraged Richard to go and fight during the crusades. Now, of course he was wrong. The apocalypse didn't come, but back then, in those days, he was extremely popular. Now, not only Joachim of Fiore was a popular celebrity when it comes to apocalyptic predictions, but he was also a Christian thinker. He had his own theory. According to Joachim of Fiore, since God is a Trinity, this triune nature of divinity is parallel to the way history unfolds on earth. So he basically compared God the Father as the first person of the Trinity with the Old Testament and with the biblical history of the Jews as the first phase of human history. Then he compared God the Son with the New Testament and with the history of the Christian church. That was the second phase in the unfolding of human destiny. And he predicted that God the Holy Spirit, this third person of the Trinity, will also give rise to the third phase of human history, which will happen someday in the future. And this third period of human history he identified with the millennium that was described in the book of Revelation chapter 20. So this future ideal millennium for Joachim of Fiore was related to God the Holy Spirit, and therefore this period should be the period of purity and perfection. And since Joachim was a monk, he thought that only monks and nuns are truly following the example of Jesus, who was never married, never had children. And therefore he thought that in this third period, during the millennium, all of the church members, lay people, priests, all of them will form a global monastic community. Everybody will become a monk and a nun. So that's why this third model of apocalyptic interpretation is called ecclesiastical model. Ecclesia means church. And Joachim of Fiore was talking about ecclesia spiritualis, spiritual church. The church will be spiritualized, and everyone will become either a monk or a nun.